He'd move his hands about this much, uh, roughly 30 inches. And he put that over the mark he had made, and he said, Rex, now draw another line there, where the other hand is. So, very dutifully, I drew the line. He said, now count the tracks. So I count. Okay, let's say there were 38 tracks. He said, now divide it by 2. Okay, about 19 deer have crossed here. I was a little skeptical about it, but we crossed the stream and then crossed a small bit of jungle, and there was a glade in the distance. And of course, as usual, we tested the wind to make sure that the wind was in our favor. You know, sometimes when it rains in the night, deer stay out in the glades a little late. You must have many of you would have noticed that. And the deer were grazing. So we counted them. Sat down and counted them very carefully, and there were 18 deer. So I asked Bevis, I said, what did you do? He said, well, I separated my hands by about 30 inches. That is the average distance between the front and hind limbs of a spotted deer. He said, now if these were buffalo, I would have separated my hands much wider. If it was wild boar, I would have had a different setting for my hands. Final thing about jungle craft was taught to me by Kaira. And he said, we were looking for something. I can't remember what. Kaira was the Vedda whom you will meet in a little while. We were looking for something, and I sort of rotated my eyes from one side to the other, and then he said, don't do that. When you are searching for something, fix your gaze on a point, turn your entire head, and then turn it back. He said, that way you are much more likely to pick out what you are looking for. Well, okay, I can go on about jungle craft for the rest of the evening, but since I will be thrown out if I speak for too long, I will move on. Now let me tell you about the leopard in the meat market. I don't know how many of you know Ampare, but I must warn you, I use the old names. Ampare is today called Ampara. Samanture is Samanpura or something like that. I'm using the names I knew in the 1950s when I was loafing in the jungles. So you will have to bear with me on that. Yes. Okay, so that was the meat market. As you come from Samanture, you pass Malvatte, there's a little tank on your right. Go about a kilometer or two, and on the right there's a meat market. It's still there. I went there a few years ago and I still saw the same old meat market with the chopping blocks. There's a road to the right which takes you past the small Anglican church and winds up at the Ampare hospital. Now, a leopard had taken to coming into the meat market at night. He used to lick up the blood, eat scraps of meat, and he frightened a few people, including a drunken carter who decided to sleep in the meat market one night and was alarmed to find a leopard almost sharing the bed with him. He screamed and the leopard took off. Anyway, so Bevis's boss, Dr. Shekovics, I will show you a photograph of him later. He used to write a lot in Loris. Dr. Shekovics had told Bevis, well, just go and check this out. So one rainy night, Bevis and I were seated in the meat market. Bevis had his double barrel Webley & Scott. I had my old Belgian single barrel. We were not out to shoot the leopard, but when you're fooling around with leopards, it's good to have some insurance. And we sat there and, well, mosquitoes bit us, ants crawled over us, all sorts of various odd things bit us in various parts of our anatomy. And there was nothing we could do. We couldn't move. We couldn't twitch a finger because if leopards are very wary characters and slightest movement would have frightened it away. And then I felt Bevis stiffen. He was seated, squatting next to me. Stiffened, and next moment he switched his torch on. And there 10 feet from us was the leopard looking at us. And so we looked at each other. I don't think the leopard would have seen us too well because of Bevis's torch. He would have been dazzled by the light. But we got a good view of him. 10 feet away from each other, we looked at each other, and then the leopard suddenly turned and jumped into the forest. Now that was the first leopard I saw in Galloya. Although we spent several years in Galloya, I only saw 2 leopards. because these were real wild leopards. These are not the leopards you see in the national parks which sit and look at you and smile at you while you're clicking away. These, they are not the human habituated leopards that most people believe are leopards. These were wild leopards, and if you had any doubt, you could have asked Jackson Pereira about it, and he would have been only too glad to tell you how the leopard almost killed him. These were really wild animals. They are very different from the behavior, really very different from the leopards you see in the national parks. The second leopard, of course, was not at all dramatic. We were coming back from Inginiagala one night, and about half a mile from my home, there was this leopard seated on the side of the road, and it was transfixed by the lights. We watched it a while, and I put my head out to get a better view, and it took off. I must have made some sound. Now, I knew this leopard very well. I used to see his pug marks in the jungle very frequently. In fact, one early morning I got up and I saw his pug marks near a fence. So our house was also in his area. There was another slightly smaller leopard. Its pug marks were a little smaller. I don't know whether it was a female or what it was. Anyway, these two leopards were around our area. So although that leopard jumped off and I only saw him once, I feel I knew him well because I used to see his pug marks and his cats all over the jungle. And ladies and gentlemen, well, I have to tell you about a bear, and it's a rather unhappy story. Bears are the one animal we always feared, especially during the middle of the year when the Palu season comes. We used to have a lot of bears. Now there again, although we used to see bear paw prints all over the jungle, I never saw a bear. Now there was at Aligalge, which is a tank a little beyond Kondawatan on the way to Inginiagala, there were lots of bears, and we hunted around that area and we saw lots of bear prints, but never saw a bear. But of course, I met a poor old man who met a bear and who had half his scalp removed and both his eyes taken out. So bears were not anything that you fooled around with, at least not when you were on foot. And then later on, when I went to Mullegama and started hunting with the Veddas, I met another chap who had one eye taken off and severe injuries. So bears were dangerous, and we always feared bears, and most of the time I carried a shotgun because of fear of bears. Elephants could be avoided, leopards would leave you alone. Even though they were wild leopards, they would take off before you see them. But bears were dangerous. And so it happened that one afternoon, Bevis Sekanak and I, we were crossing a chena about 2 miles south of Kondawatan. It was thick forest. And then we came into this chena, abandoned chena. And we were walking across it. There was a tree, a burnt out tree. And we didn't realize, but in the burnt out tree there was termites had built a nest. And the bear was feeding on termites. We didn't see it, we didn't know it was there, when it suddenly came for us, making all sorts of noises. It came for us. Well, as I said, we always carried guns, and very sadly, we had to protect ourselves. And the inevitable happened, and the bear was killed. I was very sad at that time, and I'm even more sad now when I see how endangered our bears are. But we've saved our lives, and a bear is not something you fool around with. Okay, so let me pass on to something else. All right, these are the Veddas at Mullegama. Now, here we go. Okay, we first went to Mullegama. We were taken by this gentleman, Clausen, Mr. Clausen. He was a forest officer, and he introduced us to the Veddas. This was a sort of a family outing where the whole family went to Mullegama. Now, these Veddas were not from Mullegama. Some of them came from Danigala, Ratugala, Friars Hood area. They were all brought to Mullegama when the Galloya National Park was declared. They were moved out of the park. And now, I spoke to Clausen about some of them, and he said some of these Veddas knew knew R.L. Spittle very well, and that some of these were Vedas whom Spittle had written about. Now I am going on what Clausen told me. According to him, Kaira, of course, I knew because I used to hunt with him. He was a superb hunter. This is Handunna. According to Clausen, he is the Handunna that you read of in one of Spittle's books. This is Poromola, I think, and this is possibly Gama. I'm not too sure about. That gentleman is an honorary Vedda. I can't remember his name. So, most of these Vedas knew Tisahami. I'm talking of the genuine Tisahami, not the subsequent ones which have become very famous in recent years. Anyway, having gone to Mullegama once, I knew I had to go there again and again. So I told my father, look, after you go to office, give me he had a Chevrolet station wagon, give me the station wagon, I want to go to Mullegama. So my father looked and said, told me, you want to go to Mullegama? You darn well walk. Now this was about 12 to 15 miles from my house on fairly rough terrain. And I don't think my dad really expected me, but I started walking to Mullegama. I used to walk the 12 miles. I used to hunt for a day or two with Kaira. He was a superb tracker. And then come back after 2 or 3 days, burnt black by the sun, half eaten by ticks, and come back to a mother who was very angry because she had rung up the police, the army and the Air Force and the wildlife department and said, does anybody know where my son is? Son was having a wonderful time, although the mother was not very much aware of that. Okay, so this is Kaira, whom I used to go out with quite regularly. He was a superb tracker. And well, just one more picture of him. Okay, now I just mentioned Dr. Shekovics. I want to show you a picture of him. That is Dr. Shekovics. He was the chief forest officer. And those of you who have the old Lorises from the 50s up to about the early 60s, would find a lot of articles written by him. He was a fine forester. He knew his jungles, and he wrote some very interesting articles. Shekovics was spelled S-Z-E-C-H or something like that. If you have old copies of Loris, look for his articles. They're worth reading. The launch is the same place. It may not be the same launch, but when you're going across the Senanayaka Samudra, you can still take launches from there. The launches must be newer launches. Well, we used to cross the Senanayaka Samudra quite often, Jackson and I especially, looking for, we used to cross the Senanayaka Samudra and do a little shooting on the other side. There were huge herds of buffalo, and I'm talking of the real wild buffalo, big sturdy animals, quite different from the things you see in the national parks today. And they like all buffaloes, they used to stand and stare, but the moment you walk to them, they take off. On one occasion, though, they looked like they were getting ready to charge us, but one shot in the air and they took off. So I have no hair-raising adventures with buffaloes to tell you about. Now these were the odd bods you found in the jungles in those days. Dirty, smelly fellows. Some of them smelled like wild boar themselves. And this gentleman, you can see he's wearing an old cloth hat, a dirty khaki shirt. He's got a equally dirty pair of khaki trousers. And if you look here, you see the right-hand pocket always is bulging. That's because it was filled with 12-bore shotgun cartridges. Much to my mother's dismay, because she found that my right-hand pockets got holes in them long before the left-hand pockets gave way. So I was forced to sew my own pockets after that. She refused. She said, I won't sew. Now I'm really revealing some secret information, and I can see my wife smiling because I never sew anything anymore. I leave it to her. So I'm sure she's going to tell me when I go back home, well, if you could have sewn your own pockets, you can start sewing everything else from now on. Well, we'll see. Okay, so actually the right-hand pockets used to get holes in them quite fast, so I had to put patches and crude stitching, but held the cartridges back. So I probably smelled like a wild boy in those days because I spent all my time in the jungle. If you can't see it here, but there's an old pair of brown hockey boots with holes in them, which help when you're walking through water, helps the boots to drain out fast. Well, that's the only part. This picture was taken by my father. Yeah, this is the Rolleicord camera that I was telling you about, with which I photographed Cabiria. Now, we left Gallo in 1960. I never hunted again. But I had started diving in about the mid-50s, about 1956, and that opened up another what shall I say, avenue of enterprise to me. Because like all the early divers, I was a spear fisherman. So we used to shoot fish and supplement our incomes. Of course, I never put any of my fish in my clothes cupboard after that. They were always put into the fridge. So, well, there are just a few pictures here which don't mean very much. I'm going to run through them very quickly. Yeah. Then, around the early 70s, I took an interest in seabirds. Now, I was encouraged by two people. One is Professor, he was Mr. Sarath Kotagama at that time, he's now Professor, and P.B. Karunaratne, who was probably Sri Lanka's greatest ever naturalist. And I was encouraged to do a study on seabirds, and I did a study on the migration of bridal terns. This is a bridal tern. About 500,000 of these birds fly from north to south along Colombo coast during the height of the southwest monsoon, and they can actually be seen from the shore if you have a pair of binoculars. Yeah, I did a 13-year study on this, and it is even today considered a landmark study, and the results were published in IBIS, the famous ornithological journal. Well, I'm going to be very brief now. This shows the migratory route of the birds. And this is a white-cheeked tern. Now, I recorded the first white-cheeked tern in Golbak in 1982. Second one in 1990. But there was a lot of confusion. A lot of people thought that I was mistaken. And then in 2006, the National Ringing Program captured several of these birds. They were captured, measured, photographed, ringed, and released. Since then, about 6 more specimens have been captured, and they were ringed, measured, photographed, and the newer specimens they've also taken DNA samples from each bird. Well, as I said, I was a diver from mid-1950s. I turned professional, and I was a professional for about 18 years. This photograph is sadly one of the very few pictures I have of myself. And it was taken by Rodney Jonclus. More about him later. And now we come to a very interesting story of the whale in the jungle. When Langston and I were spearfishing in the late 50s, we were staying at a fishing wadia south of Mullaitivu. And we heard, we heard a story about the bones of a whale deep in the jungle. And then how on earth can a whale get into the jungle to begin with? So, one afternoon we collared one of the youngsters at the wadia, and Langston had an old BSA 350. 3 of us got on it, and we went in search of the whale. And so we went some distance moving south, and there's an area of scrub somewhere there we turned off. We were asked to turn off. We turned off some distance and we had to park the motorbike and walk the last bit. And there, about 300 yards from the jungle, was the skeleton of a whale. It was a baleen whale. It must have been about, say, 35 feet in length. The bones had all collapsed. Creepers have grown over, shrubs had started growing over it. The bones were grey and in some greenish, it showed that the bones were there for a very long time. We don't know how long. So, in that age, we had never heard the word tsunami. And so we wondered, how on earth can a whale get into 300 meters away from the sea into the jungle? So today, in hindsight, of course, I have little doubt that there must have been a tsunami which washed that whale into the jungle. It might even have been the famous tsunami which followed the explosion of Krakatoa. We don't know. And I would appeal to you, if any of you guys are mooching around that area, just make some inquiries. I like to know whether the bones are still there. Of course, a 7-story 5-star hotel may have grown over it, which is of course quite possible, but I'm hoping that it hasn't happened. And if any of you do see, this is south of Mullaitivu, going south. Now I can't tell you how many, 15, okay. I can't tell you how far, a couple of miles. And then there's a patch of scrub. And you turn left from there, you go to the sea. So villagers knew about this. I mean, it was no secret. Everybody knew that there was a whale in the jungle. Excepting when I first heard about it, I laughed like hell. I said, how the devil can a whale get into the jungle? But as it turned out, whales do occasionally get into the jungles. So if any of you ever hear about it, or encounter it, or even see it, I saw it about 60 years ago. Okay, I don't know whether the bones are still there or not, but if any of you hear anything of it, please let me know. I would love to know. Okay, now I'm just going to, I'm told I don't have much time left, so I'm going to run through a few slides. Now this is the first ever underwater photograph I took. It was taken at Hikkadua. I took it on the 12th of November 1967. Exactly 50 years and how many days? About 4 days. 50 years and 4 days ago. I'm very proud of that picture. It was the first underwater photograph I ever took, and I think it's not too bad. Now these are some, I'm just showing you some images of marine life. It's a potato grouper, about 200 pounds. Another potato grouper.